There is something unfolding today that deserves far more attention than it has been receiving, because August 24th is not carrying the feeling of an ordinary astrological transit that simply arrives, passes through, and disappears. This moment reaches into a much more private place within you, the place where you keep thoughts you cannot explain, feelings you have learned to silence, and truths you have carefully edited before allowing anyone else to hear them. Today, Mercury in Leo forms an exact trine with Black Moon Lilith in Sagittarius, and beneath the technical language of astrology. This alignment creates an unusually open channel between your conscious voice and the parts of yourself you have spent the most time pushing into the shadows. Mercury governs the mind, communication, speech, and the way you give language to what is happening inside you. Black Moon Lilith represents the rejected, suppressed, uncomfortable, forbidden, and socially unacceptable dimensions of the self. The parts you may have been taught to hide because they were considered too intense, too honest, too inconvenient, or simply too difficult for other people to accept. When these two forces meet through a perfect trine, something remarkable can happen. A thought that has remained private can suddenly become a sentence. A feeling that has lived quietly beneath the surface can suddenly find language. You may discover that you are saying something you never consciously prepared to say, and the strangest part may be how natural it feels once the words begin. 3 zodiac signs are especially likely to experience this energy with unusual intensity, and for each of them, a very particular forbidden truth is waiting to become visible later in this reading. But before we reach those 3 signs, you need to understand why this moment carries much more weight than the aspect alone would suggest. The story actually began earlier this month. On August 12th, a total solar eclipse occurred in Leo, and this eclipse landed right next to Jupiter. That combination marked a powerful reset around identity, self-expression, visibility, and the version of yourself you have been presenting to the world. The eclipse did more than rearrange circumstances around you. It exposed what had been hidden underneath the performance. It brought attention to the version of yourself that knew how to behave correctly, say what others wanted to hear, preserve harmony, fulfill expectations, and maintain an acceptable image, even when doing so required you to disconnect from what you genuinely felt. Since that eclipse, Mercury has been moving through Leo, passing through the emotional and psychological territory that the eclipse exposed. Think of Mercury as moving through a room after a powerful storm, noticing everything that has been overturned, everything that has been uncovered, and everything that can no longer be placed neatly back where it was before. The eclipse brought hidden material into awareness, and Mercury has been giving that material language. You may have realized that certain things you believed were settled were never actually resolved. You may have caught yourself questioning why you continue to remain quiet in situations where your inner voice has been asking for honesty. You may have recognized that some of your silence was not peace at all, but simply fear wearing the appearance of maturity. Today, Mercury reaches 27 degrees of Leo and forms a perfect trine with Lilith at 27 degrees of Sagittarius. This is where the story changes from recognition into expression. The eclipse exposed the truth. Mercury has carried that truth through your mind, and now the trine gives it a smooth path toward your voice. There is no need for a dramatic confrontation to make this happen. In fact, that is precisely what makes this energy so unusual. A trine creates a 120-degree relationship between 2 points, and in astrology, it is regarded as one of the most harmonious aspects because there is very little resistance between the energies involved. Normally, that effortless quality is considered beneficial because things can move forward without excessive struggle. Yet when the energy flowing freely belongs to Lilith, the experience can become surprisingly revealing. The hidden part of you does not have to fight past every internal defense. The usual hesitation can weaken. The mental filter that normally asks whether something is appropriate, acceptable, or safe enough to say can become quieter. You might enter an ordinary conversation and suddenly hear yourself expressing something that has been waiting inside you for much longer than you realized. You may not have planned the conversation. You may not have rehearsed the words. You may not even have decided that you were ready. Yet somehow the truth arrives in complete sentences. This is what can be understood through the idea of the seduction of articulation. The truth does not necessarily force its way through a crisis. It can emerge because speaking it suddenly feels easier than continuing to suppress it. That distinction matters. When something difficult comes out through confrontation, you often feel the tension beforehand. You know you're approaching a boundary. You feel the fear, the resistance, and the internal debate. But under this trine, those warning signals may be much quieter. You might simply say what you mean, and only afterward realize how significant those words were. There can be a strange simplicity to the experience, as though you are not revealing something new at all, but finally giving a name to something that has existed inside you for a very long time. This is where the psychological power of the alignment becomes impossible to ignore. The most suppressed truth is often not hidden because you do not know it. It is hidden because acknowledging it would require you to change how you see yourself, how you relate to someone else, or how you participate in a situation you have tolerated for too long. Sometimes the mind protects you by keeping certain truths vague. If you never say the thought clearly, you can continue postponing what it demands from you. But when Mercury gives Lilith language, vagueness can disappear. Suddenly, the thought has a shape. The feeling has a name. The realization has a voice. And once something has been spoken, it becomes much harder to pretend that you never knew it. That does not mean every truth revealed today will be comfortable. And it does not mean every statement will automatically create freedom without consequences. Some truths can liberate you quietly, while others can change the emotional atmosphere of an entire room. The important point is that this energy does not carefully separate the two before the words emerge. It simply allows what has been suppressed to move. That is why awareness matters today. You do not need to fear this transit, but you do need to recognize its potential. There is also a very specific timing factor that makes this moment feel like a closing chapter. On August 25th, the very next day, Mercury enters Virgo. The quality of the mind then changes significantly, moving away from the fiery, expressive, bold, emotionally exposed style of Leo and toward the more analytical, careful, measured, and detail-oriented nature of Virgo. Today, therefore, represents the final day of this particular fearless quality of expression, before the atmosphere changes. The opportunity to speak from that raw and uncensored place may not feel the same once Mercury crosses into Virgo. What remains unspoken can become something the mind analyzes again, organizes, questions, edits, and potentially places back into silence. That is why this moment can feel like the final release of everything the eclipse season has been uncovering. If something has been rising inside you, if a realization has repeatedly returned, if there is a sentence you have mentally rehearsed without ever allowing it to leave your mouth, pay attention to the feelings surrounding it today. The point is not to force a confession or manufacture a dramatic moment. The point is to notice what your own mind is finally willing to acknowledge. Sometimes awakening does not arrive as a thunderclap. Sometimes it sounds like your own voice saying one honest sentence that you suddenly realize you have been avoiding for months or years. And when that sentence arrives without fear, without elaborate preparation, and without the usual instinct to take it back, you may understand why this alignment carries such psychological significance. The eclipse removes something from your field of vision. Mercury has been processing what was revealed, and Lilith now gives the hidden material permission to speak. For 3 zodiac signs, that process is likely to become especially personal, and the specific truth each sign may encounter is where this story becomes even more revealing. So, if you have already noticed yourself speaking more directly this week, revealing thoughts you normally keep private, or recognizing that your usual filters are becoming harder to maintain, do not dismiss that experience as random. It may be the beginning of the exact shift this alignment is bringing to the surface. And the next part will show why 3 signs in particular are positioned to feel it most deeply. Something much bigger is being activated here than a simple conversation between Mercury and Black Moon. Lilith, because this transit is drawing 3 signs into the same current, and once you understand the geometry, the entire message becomes much harder to ignore. Mercury is positioned at 27 degrees of Leo, while Lilith stands at 27 degrees of Sagittarius, creating a 120-degree trine between them. On its own, that already creates a powerful connection between communication and the hidden parts of the psyche. But there is another layer that deserves your attention. When 2 points belonging to the fire element are activated in this way, the third point of that elemental pattern naturally becomes part of the energetic picture. And that missing point falls at 27 degrees of Aries. There is no planet currently occupying late Aries, yet the geometry itself forms what can essentially be understood as a grand fire trine, connecting Leo, Sagittarius, and Aries into one continuous circuit of fiery energy. That means if your sun, moon, or rising sign falls in Leo, Sagittarius, or Aries, you may experience this alignment in a way that feels unusually personal, immediate, and difficult to dismiss. Each sign is approaching a different hidden realization, and the word forbidden matters here because the truth itself is not necessarily harmful or wrong. It becomes forbidden because somewhere along the way you learned that expressing it would make you unacceptable. Perhaps your family taught you to suppress certain desires. Perhaps your culture gave you rules about how you were supposed to behave. Perhaps a belief system became so deeply embedded in you that you eventually forgot it was something you learned rather than something you consciously chose. Lilith does not negotiate with those old rules, and Mercury gives language to whatever has been waiting underneath them. For Leo, this brings us directly into the truth behind the mask. If you have Leo as your sun, moon, or rising sign, pay very close attention to what has been happening inside you this month, because the August 12th eclipse did not simply create a temporary emotional disturbance. It challenged the identity you have been presenting to the world. You may have spent years becoming the person who appears confident, capable, expressive, strong, and composed, the person others expect to walk into the room already knowing exactly what to do. Yet beneath that polished image, something may have been changing. The identity that once protected you may now feel restrictive. You may notice yourself becoming restless with roles that used to feel natural, especially roles that require you to perform confidence, even when your inner world is asking for something more honest. That cracking sensation is not necessarily evidence that something is going wrong. It can be the psychological sign that an old performance is no longer large enough to contain who you are becoming. The deeper message of this trine is that your strongest creative force may exist inside the very qualities you were once encouraged to conceal. The intensity that once made you question yourself may actually be part of what gives your voice its impact. The emotional depth you once considered excessive may be what makes your creative work memorable. The honesty you once softened to keep other people comfortable may be the very quality that makes people pay attention when you speak. Think about the parts of yourself you have repeatedly edited. Maybe there is a creative idea you abandoned because someone considered it too unusual, too personal, too dark, or too strange. Maybe you changed the way you express yourself because your natural intensity made someone else uncomfortable. Maybe there are aspects of love, romance, intimacy, play, or desire that you learned to reduce because you were given the message that they were simply too much. Today, Mercury in Leo forms this direct connection with Lilith in your 5th house of creativity, romance, and self-expression, and that creates an opening for you to recognize something that may completely change the way you understand yourself. The trait you have been trying to remove from your personality may not be the flaw you assumed it was. It may be the source of your magnetism. You may suddenly find yourself able to speak about it without constructing a defense around it, without apologizing before anyone has even objected, and without needing everyone else to approve. The power here is not loudness. It is not domination. It is not ego. It is the quiet certainty that comes when you stop dividing yourself into acceptable pieces and unacceptable pieces. The eclipse began the process of removing the outer layer, and today Mercury gives the emerging version of you a voice. If you have felt over the last couple of weeks that pretending is becoming increasingly exhausting, that certain roles no longer fit, or that you cannot keep presenting the same version of yourself simply because other people are familiar with it, this is the deeper reason that feeling may have been intensifying. For Sagittarius, the hidden realization takes a different form, because the question is not primarily about what you show the world, but why you keep moving away from anything that might require you to remain still. If Sagittarius is your sun, moon, or rising sign, the truth arriving through this transit may feel uncomfortable precisely because it comes from within, rather than from an external event. Your natural instinct is toward freedom, discovery, expansion, travel, learning, possibility, and the next horizon waiting somewhere beyond the one you can currently see. That quality is one of your greatest strengths. Your curiosity keeps life from becoming stagnant, and your desire to explore allows you to experience possibilities that other people may never consider. But Lilith has been moving through Sagittarius in your first house of identity, and that placement can expose the shadow hiding inside even your most admirable qualities. It asks a question that can be difficult to answer honestly. What if your constant movement is not always an expression of freedom? What if part of it has sometimes been a way to avoid staying long enough to be vulnerable? What if the next journey, the next idea, the next philosophy, and the next horizon have occasionally provided an escape from the discomfort of being fully known? This does not mean your desire for adventure is false. It means there may be another motivation operating underneath it that you have not always wanted to examine. There can be a deep subconscious fear that stopping means becoming trapped. Choosing one direction can feel like closing every other door. Committing to one person can feel like surrendering your independence. Building roots in one place can feel as though your identity itself is being taken away. For someone who values freedom as deeply as Sagittarius does, that possibility can feel almost unbearable. Yet Mercury, moving through your 9th house today, gives you the language to understand what Lilith has been revealing at the level of identity. The realization may be that commitment itself is not necessarily the cage you feared. Sometimes the endless search can become the cage. Constantly looking for another destination can prevent you from discovering what exists when you finally stop long enough to experience depth. Philosophical exploration can become a way of remaining above your emotions rather than entering them. Refusing to settle can become a method of avoiding the vulnerability that comes from actually building something and allowing it to matter. The difficult realization is not that you need to abandon freedom. It is that freedom without emotional honesty can become another form of avoidance. You may find yourself expressing a desire today that you have rarely admitted, perhaps, about the life you truly want, the future. You have secretly imagined the relationship you have been afraid to deepen, or the foundation you have been repeatedly approaching without allowing yourself to establish it. The statement may be remarkably simple. It may not sound like a dramatic revelation at all. It may feel more like finally putting language around something you have known for a long time, but kept circling, because acknowledging it would make the next choice unavoidable. That is the nature of this trine. Mercury translates into words what Lilith has been communicating silently through your deeper instincts. The breakthrough is not that Sagittarius must stop exploring. The breakthrough is realizing that choosing to remain somewhere can also be an expression of freedom, when the choice comes from genuine desire rather than obligation. Staying because you are forced to is confinement. Staying because you finally know what you want can be liberation. And once you can say that distinction out loud, the way you understand your own independence may change in a lasting way. Then we arrive at Aries, the third point, completing this fire pattern, and the truth waiting here goes even deeper into desire itself. If Aries is your sun, moon, or rising sign, this message is especially important because your natural response to life is usually movement. You act, you initiate, you test reality through experience. When something needs to be understood, your instinct is often to do something about it, rather than sit indefinitely inside the uncertainty. You are comfortable with momentum, with risk, with taking the first step and discovering the answer while moving forward. Yet this alignment creates a different kind of challenge. Instead of immediately acting on what you feel, the energy begins asking you to notice the feeling before you turn it into action. Mercury is traveling through your fifth house, the area associated with creativity, pleasure, romance, play, and personal expression, while Lilith occupies your ninth house, connected with beliefs, higher learning, and the philosophies that influence the way you interpret the world. This creates a powerful meeting between what you genuinely desire and the beliefs that have shaped what you believe you are allowed to desire, and that is where the next layer of this fire trine begins to reveal itself. Aries. The final piece of your story becomes even clearer when we look at Mars, your ruling planet, because Mars is currently moving through Cancer in your fourth house of home roots and emotional foundations. And that placement changes the way you normally respond to pressure. Your instinct is usually to move, act, solve, confront, and keep going, especially when emotions become complicated. You are often far more comfortable taking action than sitting quietly with a feeling that has no immediate solution. But Mars, in Cancer, does not allow you to operate entirely from that familiar strategy of pushing ahead now and processing emotions later. Instead, it draws your attention inward, toward your private emotional world, your history, your sense of safety, your roots, and the feelings you may normally prefer to keep underneath the surface. Whether you consciously want to examine those things or not, something is asking you to slow down enough to actually feel what is happening inside you. That vulnerability is not weakening the energy of this transit. It is precisely what gives it so much power. The truth waiting for Aries today is connected to desire, and not a small or superficial desire, but the deep, genuine, intensely personal things you actually want from life. There may be wants you have repeatedly pushed aside, not necessarily because another person directly prohibited them, but because somewhere along the way you absorbed the idea that having those desires was unacceptable. Perhaps your family gave you a definition of what was considered appropriate or responsible. Perhaps religious or cultural teachings influenced your understanding of what you were permitted to want. Or perhaps no one ever explicitly told you that your desires were wrong, yet you still absorbed an invisible rule that said, wanting something simply because it brings you happiness, pleasure, creative fulfillment, or personal satisfaction was somehow selfish. These beliefs can become so deeply rooted that eventually you stop recognizing them as beliefs at all. They begin to feel like facts. Lilith, moving through your ninth house, has been challenging those internal rules, gradually exposing the philosophies and assumptions that have shaped your definition of what is acceptable for you to desire. It can feel unsettling because questioning an old belief is not always as simple as changing an opinion. Sometimes it means realizing that an entire part of your identity has been organized around a rule you never consciously chose. Today, Mercury, moving through your fifth house of creativity, pleasure, romance, and self-expression, completes its trine with Lilith, creating an opening for you to finally put language around the desire beneath all those layers of conditioning. This is not about identifying what you are supposed to want. It is about recognizing what you genuinely want when the expectations, social approval, family conditioning, and inherited rules become quiet enough for your own voice to be heard. You may suddenly understand the difference between a desire that comes from your authentic self and a desire you adopted because it made you easier for other people to accept. That distinction can be enormous. You may find yourself admitting something privately to yourself first, or perhaps expressing it to someone you trust, a partner, a friend, or another person who has a meaningful place in your life. The words themselves may seem simple, but their emotional impact can be profound, because once you clearly name something you have spent years avoiding, your relationship with that desire changes permanently. You cannot completely return to not knowing. You cannot convince yourself that the truth was never there once you have heard yourself acknowledge it. And I want you to understand that this realization does not automatically make you selfish, irresponsible, or reckless. Wanting something does not mean you must act without consideration. Desire and recklessness are not the same thing. In fact, becoming honest about what you want can be the beginning of making much more conscious choices, because you are no longer building your life around desires you are afraid to admit. The parts of yourself you have locked away may contain more than pleasure. They may contain creativity, vitality, emotional truth, and the energy necessary to become more fully yourself. The armor begins to loosen because force is no longer the only way you know how to protect yourself. For Aries, this can become one of the most important lessons of the entire transit. You have often been taught to associate courage with movement, confrontation, independence, and decisive action. But there is another form of courage that requires no charge forward at all. Sometimes courage means remaining present while your emotions are exposed. Sometimes courage means admitting that something matters to you. Sometimes courage means saying what you want without knowing exactly what happens afterward. With Mars in Cancer pulling your attention toward emotional foundations, vulnerability becomes part of the strength you are being asked to develop. The question is no longer simply whether you can get what you want. The deeper question is whether you are willing to become honest enough to admit what you want in the first place. That is where this transit can become a genuine turning point for you. And because this window is temporary, the timing matters. The Mercury and Lilith alignment perfects today at 2:15 in the morning. And then on August 25th, Mercury moves into Virgo, changing the atmosphere considerably. The fiery quality of direct expression begins, giving way to a more analytical, precise, cautious, and measured mental approach. That shift is not something you need to fear or resist. In fact, it serves an important purpose. What you recognize and express during this trine eventually needs structure if it is going to become part of your actual life. A powerful realization can change you internally, but practical action is what allows that realization to become part of your everyday reality. The boldness of the fire energy reveals what matters, while the later Virgo influence can help you organize, examine, and integrate what you have discovered. In other words, the truth needs somewhere real to live. It needs practical expression, not simply emotional intensity. That is why today deserves your attention. If something surfaces inside you that you have been suppressing for weeks, months, or even years, do not automatically dismiss it simply because it makes you uncomfortable. You do not have to force yourself into an immediate decision, but you should allow yourself to recognize what has appeared. Do not immediately bury it under the familiar explanations. Do not tell yourself that your feelings are inconvenient. Do not automatically postpone the conversation with yourself because another time seems easier. The particular openness created by this alignment will change once Mercury enters Virgo, and the mind may begin analyzing what it currently allows itself to express more freely. Sometimes, a person feels a genuine internal shift, and then becomes so cautious afterward that they return to the exact emotional position they were trying to leave. The realization becomes quieter, the urgency disappears, and eventually they wonder why nothing in their life changed. That pattern is precisely what this moment is asking you to notice. The purpose is not to create unnecessary drama. It is to stop abandoning your own truth, simply because acknowledging it requires courage. If you are Leo, Sagittarius, or Aries, this message may feel especially direct. But even if your chart does not place you strongly in one of those signs, You may still recognize the emotional pattern if you have felt increasing pressure to express something genuine. The August 12th total solar eclipse in Leo opened the process by exposing what could no longer remain hidden. Mercury has been moving through Leo, giving thought and language to what was uncovered. Today, through its exact trine with Black Moon Lilith in Sagittarius, the hidden material receives a direct pathway into expression. Lilith is not interested in making the truth socially convenient. The energy is less concerned with whether something sounds polite and more concerned with whether it is authentic. That does not mean every impulse should be spoken without consideration. It means you are being invited to distinguish between silence created by wisdom and silence created by fear. That distinction can change everything. A truth does not need to be dramatic to be transformative. Sometimes one honest sentence changes the way you see a relationship. Sometimes one admission changes the way you understand your own identity. Sometimes the most important revelation is simply the moment you stop lying to yourself about what you want. Once you have heard your own voice express what is real, returning completely to the old performance becomes much more difficult. The person who speaks the truth is not exactly the same person who is afraid to speak it. That is the deeper gift hidden inside this alignment. It is not that astrology magically makes your life change without your participation. It is that certain moments can create enough psychological openness for you to recognize something that was already waiting inside you, and recognition changes the choices that become possible afterward. So as this window reaches its final hours, pay attention to what your own inner world is trying to communicate. The next movement into Virgo will bring a different kind of consciousness, one that can help you examine and ground what has been uncovered. But first, you have to be willing to acknowledge what is actually there. If this message has connected with something you have been experiencing, take a moment to reflect on your own sign and on the truth you may have been postponing. Consider what has been rising to the surface, what you have been afraid to name, and what might become possible if you stop treating your own desires as something that automatically needed to be justified. And if this reading resonated with you, your experience is part of a much larger collective moment of recognition, which is why sharing your sign and the realization that has been emerging for you can create a meaningful sense of connection with others moving through similar inner shifts. Take care of yourself as you move through this transition and allow what has become clear to remain clear. Because the next stage is not about discovering another truth, but about understanding what you will do with the one that has finally found its voice.